it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Tom, Chris and Steve, who are going to give us the tour. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, thanks everyone for turning up today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce one of my oldest friends, Steve, and one of my newest friends, Chris. Me and Chris are all punks, and Steve is a raver and a squatter, as well as Chris, and I'm also a punk, squatter, raver. So I think we've got it all pretty much covered. This is a bit of a crash course, because obviously me and Steve, we speak for hours about all the old parties, and we've only got 40 minutes, but we'll try and get a few things across. I've got a few slides which I'll show as well as we go through. Obviously, anyone who was squatted always bought this Bible, the Squatter's Handbook. I think you can still buy them now. The last one I bought was about 15 quid though, which is a bit annoying, because it was 30p when we started. And then I'm just gonna, this is the London Fields Lido, everyone knows that, where we used to do parties before it was made into this beautiful Lido that we can see today. So this is one of we used to do these parties there. And we started off with the minuscule sound, not the Ministry of Sound, but the minuscule, with the smallest raves in the cubicles there. And that's still going. And then I think punk, for me, in some ways started back with Rock Against Racism, with the Clash. So Hackney's always been this place where alternative attitudes, anarchist attitudes, the DIY spirit, the punk spirit has lived, taken hold, and really flourished. So this is in 1979, which is the first year I came to Hackney, and I got involved in a big school fight up on Chatsworth Road, which I've just been talking to Steve about. Now I'm going to stop for a second, and I'm going to introduce Chris. Chris is a long-term Hackney resident and started up, he's part of the Liberators, doing raves in Hackney, and has Stay Up Forever Records. And he, as far as I know, squatted on the Stamford Hill estate. This is a poster by Simon Blaggart, who's made some incredible posters about squatters and travellers in Hackney. So I thought I'd start with this. So Chris, I believe you're in a few punk bands. In fact, I got to see you in your last ever showing a few weeks ago of Hagar the Womb in the Hope and Anchor in Islington. So what brought you to Hackney and what brought you to punk? So we'll start with the squatting and the punk thing to begin with.
Right, so I was in Hagar the Womb. I came to Hackney. Me and my girlfriend moved into a house in Stoke Newton off this old park. We lived there for about a year with some other punks. That was a rented house, and then we had to get out of there, and we ended up moving to Stamford Hill, onto Stamford Hill estate. I think that was probably around 85, 86. So we lived there for 2 or 3 years, and we're there when this, I think you just showed a photograph of the eviction, which was a massive eviction at the time. I mean, there was burnt out cars, there was 100 and something squats on the estate at the time. So it was a big political thing when he got evicted. So Hagar the Womb were going through the early 80s. We did a lot of squats, played the Chats Palace with some of Hagar the Womb, lived in Brougham Road. I don't know if you know, there was a big lot of squats there with the mob, and a lot of other people living there. Some of the Hagar the Womb squatted there as well. We were very much involved in the 80s in the squat scene in Hackney. We carried on living in Hackney for a long time after that, and then of course met Steve, started doing raves in Lordship Park. The first squat parties we did were there in Mentmore Terrace. So carried on into the 90s. We started doing techno parties and punk things as well. Aaron Liberator lived in West Bank, did some parties there. lots of punks mixing up with ravers at the time. So a healthy squat scene going on all the way through the 90s.
Brilliant, yeah. I mean, for me, it was an incredible place, obviously, because there's so many empty properties. So when we turned up, I turned up about 40 odd years ago, you could literally walk down streets around Hackney and just choose a house you wanted to move into. And not paying rent, obviously, or a mortgage. So that was quite amazing. This is actually in Hackney Wick. This is the site of the new V&A museum, where I've got some work now. And they had a lot of parties on Carpenter's Road. I took this picture from across the canal until they realised what I was doing, and they threw stones at me because they couldn't see who I was. But that was quite funny. But Hackney was an incredible place for me as a young person to arrive. I arrived from Dorset, and it seemed like a wild wasteland. So that's where I'm going to introduce Steve. So Steve was actually born in Hackney, raised in Hackney, and unlike me and Chris, who came here, discovered this new incredible playground for the dispossessed in a way. You had to actually see these horrible squatters, these horrible punks arrive on your estate.
Disgusting.
So what was that like, seeing these people arriving, and what were your thoughts about Hackney and the culture that was coming to Hackney at that time?
Yeah, I'm from Gascoigne Estate down in just off Welsh Street. And yeah, when I was growing up there as a young lad, the squatters that came to our estate were what we just considered them dirty little, they were just glue sniffing and doing drugs, and they were just a mess. Do you know what I mean? And I didn't have any knowledge of what squatting was. These people were just living on our estate, and there was loads of them living there. And like most things back then, you kind of followed the trend of people who didn't like them, because people from my estate were like, who are these fuckers that are coming in here and they're not paying any rent, they're leaving mess everywhere, and they're sniffing glue and, and smoking weed and all that. And so I followed that trend, until my sister became one of those squatters on the estate. And so when she was like 15 years old or 16 years old, she buggered off from the house, and her friends started squatting. And then your opinion changes of what squatters are, right? Because later on, when they were still squatting, they're all going to work. And so you realise it's not just about people, not paying rent and drugs and being a mess and having parties, although I later come to love those parties and be part of those parties. You realise that there was actually more of a necessity in some ways for people who were squatting. Over the years, I've known loads of squatters that they're running businesses and they're going to work every day and they're living normal lives, but they just happen to be squatting rather than, paying rent, because they couldn't pay rent, they couldn't pay their mortgages. So for me, it was a real eye-opener, coming from, not understanding what they was, and then right the way through to actually being a squatter in Hackney and other places, many other places. So it was, because a huge eye-opener, and it was a big part of my understanding of politics and, societal changes, and how people do stuff like that through necessity, not just because they wanted to do that. I mean, there was a lot of people in my life of being on the road and squatting where there were people that chose it. They didn't need to do it, they had money, but they chose it because it became a lifestyle choice in a way for a lot of people. And in some ways they were kind of outcasted in a way, a lot of those people, because the people who had to do it, who didn't have, bank accounts or didn't have money coming to them when they reached 25, got a bit annoyed with them, these people. But it became a lifestyle choice as well. People, it became a style, a trend, to live in a squat and not pay rent and be a bit anarchic and walk around with a dog on a string. That was that kind of thing. Right.
Yeah, for me, it was a huge education. I turned up into Hackney as a tree surgeon, and then I ended up getting kicked out of a flat, moved into a house, and then suddenly I got introduced to a whole community. And it wasn't an isolated community. The slide I got up now, Chris mentioned, this is Bruffham Road. And when you walk down Bruffham Road on the west side of London Fields, there's always big vehicles parked up there, trucks, buses, caravans. And those people were coming and going. So they were part of the traveller movement that put on free festivals at Stonehenge, the free Albion festivals around the countryside. So they were forming bands, and they were taking the culture around the whole country. And then we were talking about earlier places like Chrysol Crescent. And then I moved into Ellingford Road, where we squatted around 50 houses and there was around 120 people living there. So it was a massive community of people coming and going, sharing ideas, alternative ideas of how to live together, how to share spaces, alternative communities. And part of that came from bands like the band you mentioned earlier, the Mob, Crass, the anarcho-punk movement, which is what you were very much part of. And for me, going to those early parties was quite an amazing experience. We go to something like the Samuel Pepys pub then, on Mare Street, till sort of 1 o'clock in the morning. And then there was no mobile phones, obviously, so we'd always go to a party afterwards. And to begin with, the parties were always in big houses, always squats. And then always in the garden or in the basement, there'd be a punk band playing, Hagar the Womb, the Mob, something like that. And then it changed. But were you involved in those sort of squat parties, and how did that feel being involved in that? And what were their influence around from punk with Crass and that DIY culture?
I mean, for me, like you were saying, Steve was saying, squatting was a necessity for me during the 80s. I mean, we couldn't, my daughter's 21 now and she still lives at home with us. There's no outlet for young people to go and do their own thing, which I think is the saddest thing of the times, really. We were able to just, move out of home, go and live somewhere. The squatting community was very political. Like Steve said, there was a lot of people that did it for the fashion of it, but most people did it out of necessity. And the anarcho-punk scene was a massive catalyst to regenerate squatting from the 60s. In the late 70s, the anarcho-punk scene kind of, like you were saying, Brown Road, the Mob, all these bands, all these people and activists got the travelling community. It became a big thing again.
I'd just like to talk a little bit about that transition from those punk parties, and then with people like Spiral Tribe and all this sort of thing. And this is actually Steve when he was in Hostel Meets, when we did a few parties out in Europe. Yeah. But I'm quite interested. Oh, there's Steve on top of the speaker stack, if you can see him. That's where you always find Steve, on top of a speaker stack. And I'm also quite interested in the culture that happened at that time. When I first arrived in squatting, you had the punk bands, but you'd also have the early, weren't raised, but the whirly gig down in Shoreditch Town Hall, which was these fluffy hippies with lots of fluffy decor everywhere. But you also had, just down the road, you had the Four Aces nightclub with the drum and bass. And I've heard Steve talk about this before. When I first started going to the raves, if they were called, they weren't called raves then really, they were sort of called parties. But I went to Steve's Bedlam parties on Memble Terrace, and you did some parties on Memble Terrace. And we're both wearing 2000 Dirty Squatter t-shirts from a band that squatted on Memble Terrace. Although their slogan was "Weigh it in," and when I'm getting distracted now, but when my mates squatted this place, that was quite a fun time. And then when they left, that was weighed in. All those beautiful oak panels were taken off to France, but they caught them at the border, luckily, and brought the wood panels back. Dirty squatters nicking everything. But I was very interested in that aesthetic that Steve brought to the parties, because everyone else was going quite fluffy and quite light. And then when you went to Bedlam parties around Hackney in the squats, it was very dark. There was no decor. There'd be one light, and it'd be just, I won't swear, it was very, very heavy bass. So do you want to talk a bit about your influences on why you put the parties on, how you got involved in rave? Because it's quite different than what was happening, because it's all happy house, but Bedlam was quite different, wasn't it? And the raves that happened in Hackney that came out of that industrial history.
Yeah, it did get quite dark. Yeah, I mean, going back a little bit more, for me, like how I got involved is being born and bred in Hackney. We grew up on sound systems, but it was reggae sound systems. It was the blues dances that was in the community centres or in the Four Aces at the time, and things like that. So from when I was a little kid, I always wanted to have a sound system, but it was never going to be anything other than a reggae sound system. That's what my love was, or is still, and the passion was there. And I eventually started going to parties like at Chris's Lordship Park, and I'd go to this party, and it had like a fireman's pole going from one floor to the other floor, straight down the middle. And I remember actually, Chris, going to a party, and I think it might have been where we first kind of connected, but you correctly, it was in East London somewhere, maybe Poplar, somewhere like that, and we had to climb over walls to get Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I didn't dream it. It wasn't a trip or something. And I remember going to, and there was all these punk bands playing, and it was all of that. And I got into rave through going to Glastonbury, meeting the Travellers and Travellers Field, and then going on the road and going to parties, and and just having that life. And we brought the rave to. We didn't bring a rave to Hackney. Hackney was always a bit of an epicenter for things like that. The empty buildings meant that we had so many opportunities. We could do a party every week in Hackney, and it would be a different venue, and it would be a variety of venues as well. And bringing, as Tom was saying about how it got dark, it did get dark because of what happened in Castle Morton, which if any of you don't know about, have a look, read about it. It all got very dark. I think is that over? Yeah. And the Criminal Justice Bill, which happened afterwards, after Castle Morton. They basically used us as the the front page to bring in this evil law, which has actually, if you read through it, the majority of it's nothing to do with ravers, travellers, or squatters. It's all about land rights, and they used us as the poster for it. But after that happened, the vibe got dark, so the music got dark. The music really reflected, similar like punk. I was never a punk. I used to see them on the streets, but I was never a punk. But now I know that the music reflected what was going on in society at the time. And that's the same thing as what happened with the music in the rave scene after Castle Morton, after the Criminal Justice Act. It got quite dark, because our mood was dark. So we didn't want to put hands in the air to piano chords. We wanted some, like we were angry. And so we played that anger. And I think the party you're thinking of, the one light, was that not the same as the candlelit party? When, I remember that. Remember I was in Hackney, and we'd hired a lighting company to come and bring some lights to our party, and we got busted, I think. We got busted at Mentmore Terrace, I think, was where our first party was going to be. We got busted twice that night, but as such as it was back then, it was like, right, next venue. Where do we go? Let's find another one. And we found this venue in Wallace Road down in Hackney Wick. And the lighting guys like, I've had enough. I've set up twice and there's no party, so we're not coming to that one. So we're like, okay, cool. So we just went down there and we just got a load of candles, and we just had this candle lit rave, which sounds really romantic, but it was quite dark, as you can imagine. All these lovely candles everywhere. We were just waiting for the place to just go on fire. But it didn't. But yeah, the music definitely reflected the vibe of what was going on in society at the time. And I think, hopefully now it still does. I don't know. Hopefully.
So, Chris, I've got a poster made up at Chat's Palace where I used to work. Do you remember that poster?
Yeah, I do actually. Yeah, I remember playing Chat's Palace with a mob. And yeah, I remember that gig.
Okay, yeah. And it's for the benefit of advisory service for squatters, which is this amazing place that used to be on Balls Pond Road, which to give free legal advice to squatters who were facing eviction, face being moved on. So it was a really important place for squatters in the whole of London, but especially around North London. So that was a really important thing. And I just wanted to ask you about the crossover for you between, you're still playing part of punk band, Dolshite, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're still obviously liberating. You're playing every weekend all around the world. So how do you see the two things connected between the raves and the punk? How do you sort of talk about that?
I think with the history of squats in the punk scene, and as Steve said earlier, there was a big connection. I mean, when we did our first Liberator parties, it was a lot of punk rockers coming who'd never heard techno before, and we were like having punk bands in the basement of the squat and having techno on the first floor, and so there was a big crossover. I don't think the punks liked it at first. I remember just sort of spending a lot of time arguing with them, not in a bad way, but just talking to people like, well, there's loads of punks, and they didn't like the music, but took loads of E and just stood there chewing away, going, fucking hate this music. But it was the history of the squat thing was there. So when we started raving, we were very much out of that kind of, we don't want to do commercial raves. You talk about the Four Aces, and Four Aces was very underground, but there was lots of kind of raves that we went to, a lot of us at the time, and just felt out of place. We wanted to do it in a squat, wanted to do it in a place that felt like our kind of place. And that really we had that squatting mentality, so we did squat parties, and that was literally how it started. And then we met Steve and other people, like-minded people that were doing the same thing. It was a big kind of jump forward for a lot of people, because it was like suddenly we can do techno in this same environment. So yeah, that's how it really came together. We're doing punk rock parties with techno. That was literally what it was,
Right. Can I just hang? But so one of the things that I really remember about the squats in the early days, for me, early days anyway, which was in the early 90s, was the melting pot of people that were in the squats. Obviously the punks were there doing it prior to the raver crew, if you like, the rave scene coming into that world. But when you went to those parties in the squats, it was such a melting pot of people. And then we would move these parties into warehouses because they got bigger, and you would see the same people coming to the warehouse. Like Chris says, there was a clash between people. We had it the same with the travelling community when we hit the road in like 91, when the ravers of the cities hit the road, and the travelling community were just like, the fuck is this? Who are you lot? Don't bring your trouble here. They didn't like it. And then some of the travellers were like, no, this is great. This is brilliant. This is punk. This is what they're doing. But it was nothing better than seeing someone with a 2-foot mohawk raving their backsides off at the front of a sound system, and they're playing Happy House, or they're playing hardcore, or they're playing jungle, or something like that. It was the melting pot was brilliant. It was such an education. You could meet all types of people in these squats, and you learned so much from it. So there's so much more to what the press or the facade of what squatting is. That was one of my biggest education lessons, really.
Yeah. I think the thing about history, which I've noticed, because there's a lot of people writing books, there's a lot of things like this now. It is in the minds of the people who experienced it, and that's something that we forget about history. And squat parties, even after you went to France with Bedlam, they continued happening in the capital, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. It was their lifestyle. They went out every week, they experienced it, but it was never written about in Mixmag or any of the magazines. Funnily enough, now they're all over it. Now they're all, Castle Morton and blah blah blah. But it was a phenomenon that happened in the underground. The squat parties was a massive part of London's history and will be remembered. But, and I remember going to the London Museum and seeing stuff about Crass in there, and even the fact that we're doing this here today, it's important to Hackney's history that the squats are represented, because it was a massive part of it. My wife is from Hackney. She grew up around the corner from here in Homerton, and lived in flats and houses around here, and ended up squatting as well. And, it is part of our DNA. It's part of Hackney's DNA, I think. Very important, and I'm glad that it was represented today here.
Yeah, and it was an incredible time. I talked a little bit earlier about the traveller culture as well. And for me, being in Hackney at that time, we were so connected with places like Berlin, who we did parties in Berlin. In Germany, we were hanging out with people from Amsterdam, in Barcelona, from Lisbon, from Italy. All these underground cultures were connected through the traveller movement and the squatting movement. So there's a real freedom of cultures, ideas, and basically alternative ways of living, working together as a commune, not just moving into a flat where you have to pay a landlord, but you're sharing a space, you're learning how to get on with people, which I think is so important now after COVID, where we all became so isolated and so digitized, that it's great now that I think we're thinking about reconnecting again and getting out there. And I think that's why the festivals were so important, or sharing spaces or sharing houses. So, there's a few. All these pictures I'm showing are pictures that I took. I asked both of them for pictures, of course, but they never replied, obviously.
I've got pizza.
So this is, yeah, I know. But this is where I was squatting in central Hackney on Enfield Road. And this was so typical of lots of the squats. You could have a squat, and this was a scaffolding yard next to us in Hackney. And then when the scaffolders were evicted by the council, then we let our mates move in with their buses, lorries and trailers. And then next door to that, there'd be an old warehouse, which we had the grey area. We got Asian Dove Foundation to play. And that party would just go on. Yeah, it is Pat. Yeah, I think that's out in Lisbon. So, and obviously, when you're not paying rent, and you haven't got your weekly bills to pay in that way, it allows you to do different things. So, I think both of you two are still doing amazing things now, and that freedom to try the sound systems out, and try music out, try bands out, was such a luxury that we were afforded, which isn't available now in that same respect.
I just want to say though that it does continue. There is, it's very, very, very difficult to squat now because the laws changed. But there is young crews with sound systems going out and doing squat parties even now, with all the dangers of that, because it's very, very easy to lose a sound system. It's very easy to be crushed by the law, but they've still got that same spirit. And I mean, there was a squat party in South London only a few weeks ago. 6,000 people attended. It had its problems, but that's all young people inspired by the whole history of that. And I myself played they squatted a skate park in Tottenham only like 3 weeks ago, and I got to that party and played, and it was just incredible to see mostly young people, in their early 20s and late teens, doing exactly the same that we did. And so it hasn't ended. The same inspiration still puts people, out there doing this kind of stuff. And I think, people living in squats now, it's not easy, but there are a few still around, So yeah, you can't kill the spirit, as we always used to say.
Yeah, and what about now? I mean, we haven't talked about this, but you're still involved very much, not this year, obviously, because Glastonbury's got a year off, but what you're doing, what you learned then, I mean, you're doing so many things with the Refugee Community Kitchen, which feeds, I can't remember how many, feeds 1,000 people every day, and then feeding people in London as well. And then you're running the Common, the Rum Shack, and the Temple at Glastonbury. Do you think that squatting and that punk DIY attitude has set you up for life of running all these charities and all the things you're doing now?
Yeah, 100%. Like, I get asked a lot, in quite a few interviews and stuff like that, and people always ask me, is there a connection between my genesis of where I started in Hackney doing squats and squat parties, right the way through to now, which is running a charity called Refugee Community Kitchen, where we feed about 1,500 people a day in Calais, and we're doing about 150 people a day in London on the streets for the displaced people in Calais, and anybody in it's the Temple. That's my venue at Glastonbury. It's quite, I mean, I still do the music at Glastonbury, only Glastonbury now, mainly because I've got a little 5-year-old boy and I'm not getting any younger, so I want to spend as much time as I can with him. But yeah, we still got one foot in the rave, which is still amazing, and still doing that. But my main focus now is charity and feeding people, homeless people, and displaced people in Calais and Dunkirk. And without that history, without going to Glastonbury and meeting the travelling community that I met and that I later joined, became part of the biggest part of my life, really. And without doing these parties and meeting all these people in these squats and sitting around fires and chatting, then things like Refugee Community Kitchen wouldn't exist. All of my knowledge and all of my empathy and all of my courage to go out and do these things comes from this community, 100%. I'm from a single parent council estate kid, and I was talking to someone the other day about that, and I can safely say that 70% of my friends I grew up with followed down the cliche of in prison or dead, and I was lucky to get away from that, and part of that is meeting this community and thriving from that and getting knowledge and absorbing knowledge from people. It's amazing, a lot of people think of it as just a hedonistic kind of thing. You're going out, you're getting wasted, you're taking drugs, you're drinking, you're doing this, you're doing that, but it's so much more than that. And this is where I learned it all. In this squatting and travelling community. So yeah, it wouldn't exist without it.
And the same for you, Chris. I mean, you've given so much to so many people around the world with your music, and bringing people together in that shared space. How does that, what's your debt to that community, or where do you take that, and how do you feel about all that now?
that changed my life as well. I mean, the whole anarcho-punk ethos. We're all very political. I mean, I haven't done as amazing things as Steve. I mean, we support Steve every time we can do any benefit for Refugee Kitchen, we do it. But I mean, it's a lifestyle thing. It's a very interesting thing because there was a book written about anarcho-punk many years ago, and the guy that wrote it wrote a lot of other books about other types of punk, street punk, but he said the anarcho-punk scene, all the people that came from that, none of those people that he interviewed, and that was hundreds and hundreds of people who'd been in his bands, inspired by Crass and all the other people at the time, they'd all gone on to do either community-based work or very much their own thing. None of them had gone on to work for capitalist kind of corporate organisations, pretty much none of them. Whereas he said when he interviewed all the street punk people and a lot of the other types of punk, a lot of those people had kind of just, their morals, not their morals, but they'd just not really been affected by the politics of the movement, and had gone on to just get normal jobs, and do just work for the man kind of thing. So I think all of us, like in the travelling community, in the squatters, the punks, the ravers, everybody's been affected by that liberating experience. If nothing else, even just going to a rave is a liberating experience, and it changes your life and moves you forward in a different direction. We have a lot of people, I think, to thank for that. People like Steve have gone out and gone on to do really great things, which I think we should applaud.
Yeah, and not literally. Not literally.
And I think we've been talking about a lot about punk and rave, but I didn't meet someone in the corridor earlier, the 70s squatters, the hippies who were squatting in North London, all over the country, who set that way, who thought of, let's not just work, let's not just pay our taxes blindly, let's not just conform blindly, but actually look at society a different way, think how we can make a difference, think how we can change things in a positive way. So we are indebted to the squatters from the previous generations, from the hippies, from the Woodstock, the hippie lot, from that time. And we've sort of tried them to have taken that baton and we're taking that forward. And with what's happening with raves still going on, the parties bringing people together, what's happening at Glastonbury, what's happening with the charity work, has given us all a resilience and a sense of community and a sense of inclusion, which is about tolerance.
Yeah.
Which is a hard thing to say today.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's so true. I was feeling emotional just now talking about, how the connections and all of that, because I'm remembering all of those times sitting around the fires and how it filled you up and you went away. And I actually, that's why I handed the mic over. I was going to do that. And, I mean, I owe so much to that community and that scene. And to Hackney actually for holding that space for us, for the councils being really lax, the police being terrible at their job, and not shutting us down quicker, and allowing us to do these amazing things that we were part of back then.
We are great to Hackney. I think I met Steve because the police, when he was travelling around Hackney, forced everyone on the vehicles to park up on Mentmore Terrace, was where all the travellers ended up, and I squatted down the road. So thanks to Hackney. Yeah.
Mostly thanks to Hackney, but we did make a record once, which I didn't actually make, but it was on one of the labels called Hackney Council, our bunch of. So they took our sound system. They wouldn't give it back. But I forgive them for that now.
Place.
Hackney as a place, amazing, really. I mean, sitting in the park earlier on. I mean, I don't live in Hackney now. I've moved out of London, but I still feel it in my bones. But just looking around all the people in Hackney, I live in Hertford now. It's so fucking straight and a really nice place to live. And we were living in a flat with 2 kids. It was impossible for us to stay here any longer. But I love Hackney. I love looking at all the people and all the it's just so forgiving. Really, it's a very unique place, and we are lucky to have it.
Even with all the changes.
Yeah.
It's changed a lot.
Yeah, and we'll see what the Green Party does now. So
Yeah.
So let's forget about reform, celebrate inclusion, and if you can help Steve's charity out, Refugee Community Kitchen, that'd be great. People do need
Please
help.
do, yeah.
And thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thanks so much, Bill. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, thank you for a brilliant talk, and I think we all felt that. So, who would like to ask a question?
On the 70s, Hackney, particularly around the London Fields area, was renowned for lesbian and women-only squats. And I was just wondering, they came out of a particular set of social circumstances. So I'm just wondering, had they disappeared by the time that you lot were squatting, or were they still there?
What I really appreciated about what you said was the importance of squatty that engendered community, questioning of life, how you live it, and all that kind of thing. And I squatted in Whitechapel in the 70s. And as you said, there was a parallel with what you were doing. There was masses of women's squats, and they gave rise to all sorts of things, not just all the fights around women's liberation, but loads of art. Lensall Road Screen Workshop was a poster workshop which produced posters for all sorts of events. I've got some of them at home framed. And also the whole beginning of women in manual trades came out of the squatting movement because women wanted to work out, okay, how do we get the electricity back on? How could we build something here? And, we want to do it ourselves. So there was the beginnings of women in manual trades. So parallel to what you're saying, I think it's really important, the whole effect of squatting and living in an alternative way in how you see life and how you develop skills and how you react to the world. Thank you.
I just wanted to put in a word for the squatters who used to live here in the blue houses we put out by then, and to mention that I'm sure you didn't intend to say that the linen fold panelling was nicked by the squatters.
They weren't, no. Right. After they were evicted, yeah.
Yeah, because I just wanted to say that I lived here briefly for a few months, and they took
with Packer.
with Christina and Rob and Andy, Stuart. I don't know anybody's surnames. And I just wanted to say that they took great care of the place.
Yes,
and when anyone inquired about people heard about the linen fold panelling, somebody'd shuffle off and get a key and open up the room, and you had to talk in quiet voices in there for some reason.
Yeah, sorry if I made that connection between the people who took out the panelling and the squatters. I had two good friends who lived here, Packer and, what was my other friend? Mark Tinley, who did the sound for Duran Duran, actually. So he did sell out, become corporate. But they weren't involved in stealing that. That came afterwards. So this is a squat on London Lane. I squatted, there's two streets in... three streets. It was London Lane, Ellingthorpe Road and Metmore Terrace were all squatted on the east side of London Fields, about 120 people. This was an all-women's house, and I was allowed to go in there to take a picture. This is a woman called Sarah, who was a writer at the time. Like you said, I can't remember everyone's surname, sadly. But yeah, it felt quite amazing. Each house on that street and those houses had a different political identity. A woman came to see me a little while ago and said, "Oh, were they all anarchists?" Well, I said, "Well, yeah. There was a Trotsky house, there was a socialist house, there was a lesbian house, there was a working class dispatch rider's house, there's the alcohol house, there's a smackhead house." Pretty much every sort of political affiliation went in every different house. But it was great that everyone could try out the different ways of living and different ideologies of how they live together. So I didn't answer all the questions, but did anyone else want to say?
Good, because I didn't know anything about the lesbian squatting movement.
I mean, gender-specific squats at the time, because I started squatting in the 80s, so I'm not sure about the 70s, but I do remember when I was about 16 and I joined Hagar the Womb, and Hagar the Womb was an all-female band apart from me when I've joined. And Ruth and Karen lived in a squatting Hampstead, actually, not in Hackney. And that was an all-women's squat. And I remember going to the Poison Girls' house and meeting vice versa, who was a matriarch, and taught me just being there and being amongst people like that, a way of seeing gender and all sorts of other things that I learned as a really young kid, just going, oh my God, and it was... So the history of gender-specific squats, and especially women's squats, I mean, later on, we had people like Caroline. There was a lot of political women in our crew and we did lots of parties where it was mixed, but a lot of women supporting parties. There was a lot of Scots that were just women, but I don't know about the 70s ones. I'm trying to learn more about earlier times. I read a book recently that was talking about squats and stuff in the 60s, in Hackney, but also in the east part of London, which taught me a lot because I didn't know about that kind of era. So I'm not really sure about the 70s ones, but I know that did carry on. I mean, we know lots of women and lesbian people that were went on to live in squats with just women, and that still goes on to this day as well.
Yeah, and also the Bangladeshi community squatting in Whitechapel was a huge movement of trying to get those communities together, where they were being separated by the local council. So that was a really interesting history with David Hoffman's photographic work about that.
And it was the squatting movement that helped the Bangladeshi community squat, didn't they?
Yeah, to bring them together as a community, because the policy then was to separate all people, to separate the people from their own communities to make sure they got integrated, so keep them all apart. And when they were apart, with the racism being so strong in the Whitechapel at the time, they felt very isolated and victims of a lot of right-wing actions. So the squatting community brought them together so they could live as a community and work as a community and have resilience to the oppression that was happening at that time. So that was really important.
A little bit of a provocative question for you, Tom. I've been following your posts on Instagram, posting these photos recently. I remember one of your captions, you talked about journalists describing you as the stormtroopers of gentrification and hacking. Any thoughts on that?
Okay, so accusation of gentrification.
Yeah. It's quite funny. The advisory service for squatters, it should be the squatters advisory service. But I don't think they wanted to have the SAS as their title, with all these people going around in balaclavas and smashing into houses and taking them over. It was white flight when I arrived in Hackney. All the schools, we were talking about this. I was involved in school fights back in the 70s, where whole schools were fighting each other. There were murders happening in the schools, rapes happening in the schools, and Hackney was suffering severely from that. And there was a huge exodus. And we took up that slack of moving back in and changing it, and through community resilience, building communities together and helping it out. But it's the schools that have made the huge difference in Hackney, I think. Tony Blair, however much you hate him and his legacy, what those new schools did, and investing in money in the schools in Hackney, meant that when you had kids, you weren't running away to Hartfield, is it? You weren't running away as soon as you can. So that has changed things. And with the brilliant school teachers that are here and what's happened in the schools, that has changed things massively. But yeah, we were here. Yeah. So lots of our streets were were designated demolition areas. So all the area around the east side of London Fields was all going to be bulldozed, and they wanted to put up light industrial units to store, frozen chickens in. And we stopped that from happening, as the squatters did the same with the Huguenot houses down in Spitalfields. So yeah, we are the stormtroopers of gentrification, and now I can't afford to have a fucking coffee in Hackney, you bastards.
I'm just going to ask one final question. Chris, you touched on how hard it is to squat in the current climate, and I just wonder whether each of you could comment on what you see and what you hope for when it comes to sort of squatting movement as it continues in years to come.
I mean, there shouldn't be empty buildings. That's all I can say. At the end of the day, if there's disused property, then people should be able to live in it. It's really hard for people to do that now with the laws as they are. I mean, it's almost impossible to live in a squat. There's a long-running squatting archway. There's a few others dotted around, but generally it's impossible. But it's impossible for people to get on the housing ladder. There's so many opportunities for people to use the space that's there, and unfortunately, that's really becoming difficult. And I'd really like to see a surge in people trying to squat again, or at least reclaim, buildings that could be used for people to live in. And we all know how difficult it is to rent or buy or get on anywhere. My daughter's 21. The generation now, they can't do what we did, and that's bad, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking about this actually today on the way over about squatting. Now, I met someone recently. I was at a Joe Rush exhibition, and I met this person. I was like, oh, where you living? I was like, oh, I'm squatting in Hackney. I was like, really? I didn't think people were squatting anymore. She was like, no, we're still squatting. We get moved on quite a lot, but we're still squatting. It actually really lifted me up, actually, because I didn't realize it was a thing still, like people were still squatting residential houses and stuff like that. And she said, no, it's great. And it was a young woman, and she started telling me about it, what they do in the squat, and it just brought back loads of memories. And it meant that there was still these sparks being created in these squats. She moved over from Italy. She didn't know anyone. She moved into a squat. She's now got this massive community of people that she now lives with, and she's working. She's not like I said earlier, she actually goes out to work every day, but she just can't afford to rent, especially in Hackney. And I think it is still alive, but not as it was. And it's a real shame, because those melting pots of community that came from the squats isn't happening. And I don't know where it's happening if they've not got these spaces. I know that there's a lot of like the temporary autonomous crews who get buildings. They might rent a place or work in a venue, and they put on exhibitions and they put on spaces for people to come together. But it's not the same as living in it and absorbing it, 24/7. And I think it's a real shame. And I'm not going to be one of these people saying, oh, it was better back in the day, but something nice was happening in those spaces. And it would be lovely to have those spaces back in some way, legally or illegally. I don't know what the best route is. But I agree with Chris 100%. If a building's empty, it should be utilised by someone. There is a lot of these kind of guardianships, meanwhile, scenarios where people are living in empty, derelict buildings, and they're paying, a small amount of rent, which is great. But the only reason those things exist is because the companies who own them get tax breaks until they want to develop them. So, it's a weird kind of, it's a weird circle that these places are, the only places where you can have these melting pot of artists, musicians, just layabouts, whatever, anybody coming together is because it helps a corporate tax situation. I think squat a lot, basically. If it's empty, squat it. And I think, I don't know what it's like now for if you do it, whether you get beaten up or get evicted really quickly, I don't know. But I would encourage people to go out to empty buildings. One of my greatest loves in the world is going into an empty building and mooching around and just going, what is it? Wonder what was in here? What's in this drawer? And it's, and tatting, and finding stuff, not wooden panels. I didn't tat any wooden panels. It wasn't me. But that experience is it's life changing, and I would encourage people to do it more.